So our final talk today is by Paul Ehrlich, who is an internationally recognized spokesman for population biology in an increasingly challenged world. So we are going from molecules to equations to the globe. Paul is the Being Professor of Population Studies and President of the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford University.
Are we on?
We're on. You're on.
No, I mean,
Paul.
I'm setting the bezel on my watch so I don't go over the 2 hours that Larry has assigned me. I've been amazed at how he's put this together. For instance, he discovered that I was recovering from pneumonia and my voice is going, and so he invited somebody in the first session to have a problem with his voice so I wouldn't feel so bad, so that was wonderful. Then he has Robin. The thing I've been working on most recently is something that has to do with airways in children, mouth breathing, and bad development of the jaws and facial system, which lead to sleep apnea and all sorts of other things. I may say something more about that because it's part of the epidemiological transition that's not being paid attention to. Everybody knows that we're eating the wrong stuff, but very few people know we're not eating it right. We're not doing it right. But I'll come back to that. Then, of course, we have the big data, and in our area of biology, the big problem is that we're developing technologies that give us so much data we don't know what the hell to do with it. I just put out with a bunch of colleagues 80 armored camera traps in a mixed agricultural countryside in Costa Rica to try and find out how the mammals are using the countryside and what we might do to make it more hospitable to non-agricultural animals and better for agriculture. But these things can run for 6 months, and they take picture after picture after picture, and we don't have a clue how to analyze. We always have in our mind the great disaster over the ozone hole, which taught a lot of lessons people haven't picked up, but we don't know what we're gonna do about it. And finally, I should say, Jandel gave the first half of my talk. It was wonderful, and I'm gonna just go way upstream from where she was and talk about the things that I think we have to do to transform society. And I can say a couple words about whether we'll do it or not. But a very fundamental mistake, I think, was made by our president when he took on the problem of trying to fix up our totally broken, I call it the health repair system. It's not the health repair system, which was going to be very difficult. He had to cash a lot of chips and so on, and he did make some progress. But when you look at the health consequences, he would have been much better off to waste his effort, if it was going to be wasted, on climate change. Because the whole effects of how much the insurance companies steal from us, how much big pharma steals from us, and that sort of thing, is absolutely trivial compared to what's going to be the effects if we have 4 or even 2, but 4, 6, or 8 degrees Celsius increase in the general temperature. You can just forget about all those issues. There won't be any big pharma. I mean, it will be the remains of big pharma. So the basic message that I'm going to make is from a point of view of global health. And that does include our health. And as Janelle pointed out, we spend all this money on our health, and we don't do all that much better than, say, Costa Rica does, or Cuba does. I've been thrilled, by the way, that we are considering, or maybe we just took them off the terrorist list. Here we are in the top terrorist nation in the world, and we have the goal to take them off the terrorist list. 200,000 people that we killed in Cambodia, Allende, go right down the list. We're the big terrorists, and we've got the list. Give me a break. Anyway, and those things are all related to what's happening in the environmental situation. I'm not going to give you a lot of talk about the chances of nuclear war. Those of you who follow literature know that even a small one between India and Pakistan, where there are a lot of people in both countries who love to have one, would end our civilization here as well. But we're not paying attention to it. But I'd like to focus more than anything else, because of the publicity given to it, is the climate change situation and how it relates to agriculture and related things. Because the single most important human activity is getting and growing our food. And if you go to a university crowd in most places and ask them where their food comes from, what they'll tell you is the supermarket. They don't know anything about the whole system that comes together to supply us with food. They don't know anything about the demography behind it, and you'll be amazed to know that one of our problems is demographic. We have, at the moment, over 7 billion people in the world, and we're scheduled in the next 35 years, if we make it, to go to over 9.6 perhaps. That wouldn't be so bad, except today, there are over 800 million people that are hungry, that are starving, basically. Another 2 billion that are micronutrient malnourished, and to the point, for instance, with iron deficiencies and so on, they can't really function well. When people tell me how easy it's going to be to feed 9, 10, 20 billion people, depending on who you're asking, I've had the same answer since 1968. Why don't you show me you can feed the people we have today before you tell me how easy it's going to be to feed people into the intimate future? Now, you're probably all very well clued into the general picture of climate change, so I'm going to mention some things that are not well known or not well broadcast. One of the basic ones is that when you see a lot of the comments on climate change, the focus is on sea level rise. I can relieve you people here in Boulder. If it gets here, you'll be able to walk away from it. It's not that that's not a serious problem. In the longer term, it's going to be short term in some places, already is if you're on an atoll in the Pacific. But it's going to be relatively slow, and it'll probably affect seriously just a couple billion people. What are a couple billion here or there? The thing that's going to be short term, and that's going to be where the rubber really meets the road, is in agriculture, because of course agriculture is utterly dependent upon climate, particularly distribution of water, but also temperature and so on and so forth. We are as unprepared. I keep hearing people saying, well, we had a train wreck in the Northeast Corridor, and it's a result of infrastructure problems. Well, it is. We've ignored our infrastructure. The engineers keep telling us it's shot. But what are we doing about our water handling infrastructure? We know perfectly well that patterns of rainfall are changing. We know perfectly well that, in fact, we have trouble in this rich country getting clean water through our systems. In California right now, we're losing a lot of water through bursting pipes, and it turns out the pipes were put in just after the Civil War, curiously enough, and gas mains the same thing. But we need to be thinking about revising our entire water handling infrastructure if we're going to be able to do anything about it. So that's a serious problem that is not mentioned in the mass media at all, as far as I can see. What else isn't mentioned? Well, turns out the more people you have, the more greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere. And one of the main reasons is that agriculture and food, depending on how you do the numbers, and you can go off in different directions, but about a third of greenhouse gases come from our agricultural operations. And what's maybe the single biggest threat to agriculture? It's the climate change caused by those greenhouse gases. Now, we have an administration that's begun talking about this sort of stuff, but every scientist I know who follows it closely comes up with the same answer. Namely, we've got to leave most of the fossil fuels that are around in the ground, period. This tells you right off that if you're buying stock in fossil fuel companies, you're very, very, very silly, because their stock values are based on the idea that they're going to burn all this stuff. Are they going to burn it? I was just checking my email here, and there's a list of the gigantic projects. For instance, coal in Australia, they're planning to put absolutely huge amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. I'm a part-time Australian. Their present government, I haven't got any words I can use in front of ladies to describe it. My favorite 7-letter word. Anyway, I can see everybody counting that. I'll say something nice about Colorado. At the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, which is a great research lab where actually, because of it, is how Larry and I met, and our director is here. But the single most important experimental paper on climate change was just published from by John Hart at the Rocky Mountain Lab. And what he showed was incredibly scary and got very little publicity, by the way. He decided 25 years ago, he came to me, he said, Paul, he says, he was becoming the top person in the world on acid rain, again, based out of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And he says, I think climate change is going to be so much more serious than acid rain that I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to take, is it 12 plots, I think? Anyway, a series of plots on a hillside, and he's going to heat the plots to 2 degrees Celsius above normal, every other one, leaving one as a control, and just see what happens. And I said, John, it's not going to work. Too many factors will come in from outside. Not a good idea. And he said, well, I think you're wrong. And he was. He was right. I mean, I was wrong. He just he's published maybe 25 papers out of it. What's happened when you heat the soil in a mountain meadow? Well, one of the first things is that sagebrush moves in and the flowers move out. And Crested Butte, as many of you know, is where they hold a wildflower festival each year. They're going to have to start not holding a wildflower festival fairly soon. Even more serious, the carbon is leaving the soil and leaving it relatively fast in the heated plots. So all of that's not totally unexpected. One of the huge threats in the whole global climate system, even though we don't know all the details, is that carbon will leave the soils around the world, and they'll go especially fast in the Arctic regions where permafrost is not going to be perma anymore, and that's already starting. But John ran the thing for, I think it's 23 years now, and his publication, the main thing in it is that there are no longer any controls. In other words, he has the data on the carbon going off from the experimental plots, on the flowers disappearing from the experimental plots. But now his controls have been following in exactly the same pattern, so that the actual climate change is matching what went on. That's really scary. Every day I get something more scary on the climate disruption area. And I have to have a little of my gin if I'm going. Gin is much better than water for throat problems, particularly when you're talking about climate change. So we put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere last year than the year before. We're going to put in more next year. Do not be fooled by all the talk of what we're doing with renewables and with biofuels and all this sort of stuff. The key thing is how much greenhouse gas you put into the atmosphere. If wind power doubles or triples, the key answer you have to look for is that. I remember many years ago talking to an Indian government official, and he said, last year we shipped 2 million condoms into the field. And I said, what happened to the total fertility rate? I mean, after all, if they weren't used for flashlight covers, then that may have taken care of the night of January 1st and maybe January 2nd, but you're not. There's a terrible thing among bureaucrats, among government officials and so on, to tell you about the effort they're making, not the results they're getting. So a huge part of the food problem is that we know that the plants are utterly dependent on climate, particularly water, but temperature. We also know, work by David Lobel and others, that show that the feeding base of humanity is what? It's 3 grasses, basically. It's maize, it's wheat, and it's rice. Yeah, right. All those crops are threatened by temperature changes. And we've already seen reductions in the rate of increase globally, taking global statistics, in the increased production in those crops. In other words, we managed over the last 30 or 40 years to do very well in keeping the basic crop production up with human population growth. Why, by the way, are there 800 million people starving, or more than that? Some people say 900 million, or 2 billion micronutrient malnourished. It isn't because we don't have enough food. If the food were distributed equally by basal metabolism and you took some of the richer side down and so on, everybody could have adequate food. So that when you're talking about what are the things that are threatening us on the food front, actually on the entire environmental front, one, of course, is overpopulation and continuing population growth. Second is overconsumption, particularly by the rich. And one of the things that's cheery in the population situation, of course, is that populations have been declining even in some of the rich countries. Not clear that they're not turning around again, but of course that's where you have the big population problem, is among the rich, because they're the consumers. It isn't just how many people you have, it's what the hell they do. And overconsumption by the rich is a big factor. And then the third one is basically inequity around the planet. And I don't just mean gender and racial inequity, but economic inequity has a huge thing. You know, the Ronald Reagan's program of the famous Hood Robin program, where you steal from the poor and give it to the rich, has been extremely effective in the United States. You've seen the statistics. You know, we've really succeeded in taking the money away from the poor, and we have the 1%. I'm happy to, hopefully I'm at least in the 2% or something. It's very nice, but it's not good socially. So one of the things is that there's all kinds of threats to agricultural production. Another thing is that, as Sam Myers and others at Harvard showed, that as you grow these crops in warmer temperatures, their nutritive value falls. So they're getting you from another direction there. Then tied into all of this is the fact that we are, as again was indicated by Chantal, we're toxifying the entire planet. And this is something that has biologists, particularly endocrinologists, really scared, because we have learned over the last decade or so that the basic idea of toxicology is bullshit. The idea was originally, you probably learned it in high school, remember? Dose makes the poison. If common table salt can kill you, and it's true, try it tonight, go home, eat a pound of common table salt, see what happens to you. I mean, it's an experiment available to everybody, and would be very helpful to the world since we're all rich. But what they've been finding, of course, is all these hormone-mimicking chemicals that are being spread all around the planet. And the toxics, again, you don't get much talk about it. Why don't you get much talk about it? Well, curiously enough, the chemical industry absolutely depends on that. Producing synthetic chemicals and not checking them for, even in most cases, for their direct ecosystem and human effects, but looking at none of the synergisms. We know perfectly well that many actually to go to the lungs again. If you're exposed to cigarette smoke by inhaling it, and I used to do that a long time ago, it knocks down the function of the cilia in your lungs, which move a sheet of mucus out continuously and clean your lungs. If you combine that with asbestos exposure, the asbestos stays longer, and the effect of the two of them together is gigantically larger than either of them separate. Neither of them is good individually, but if you put them together, you're really good. There are roughly probably 100,000 toxic compounds out there now. If you know, with the wonderful new detection methods we have, you can have your blood analyzed and it'll look like the shelf list in an organic chemistry lab. And we don't know a thing about the synergisms, although there are weird things showing up in the global system. Lots of things with animals, but there are all sorts of things with human beings where I haven't been able to figure out, and I don't think anybody really has, things like asthma, for instance. Are we just, the question is, are we just diagnosing it more? Are we more conscious of it? ADHD, all this sort of stuff. And we're totally relaxed about it. I don't mean the people in this room, but society's relaxed about it. When did you last see anything in the newspapers about the toxic threat? If you go back to the literature, the kids that live downwind of the lead plant, they got 5 points on average less IQ than the ones who live upwind. We're all living downwind of lead plants. One of the, and figuratively, one of the interesting things that's been put forward in the literature recently is that maybe we are actually reducing the intelligence of the human population to the point where it's going to be very difficult for us to solve our problems. I have some colleagues who are actually examining the Congress to see if the anecdotal evidence there is actually here. So we have a whole series of problems with our food production system. They are really tough. I mean, the use of fossil fuels in the food system is gigantic. It can be reduced. But again, you got to look at the time course of doing some of these things, particularly when we haven't even started on them. We have the problems with toxification, which also come into the food system and the epidemiological transition. After all, we've had talk about cancer connected to obesity. We know what causes obesity, but in California, we couldn't even get a tax on the sugar content of the stuff we feed to the kids mostly. I mean, I guess everybody takes huge amounts of soda pop, but what the hell? Recently in California, they've been showing that the cigarette companies are now marketing the non-tobacco cigarettes with terms like raspberry, things to appeal to kids. Again, so I mean, none of this is accidental. Jantel, I think, is more cheerful than I am about the changes we'll have to make in our economic system. I'll come back to that. But we just run wild ahead on this stuff. We are Stanford University, to name a random place, with much student activity, we managed to get them to divest from coal. They took the money and put it into oil, I was recently told. This is supposed to be an educational institution. It's supposed to care about young people and so on. It's even supposed to care about having enough money in the future to educate young people, which if they have enough of their money in fossil fuels, that'll be gone. But of course, it's a subsidiary of the whole corporate structure. If you think Stanford and Harvard, none of these places have changed their structure or their basic attitudes at all in response to the biggest existential threat that's ever faced humanity. In other words, in environmental science, I'm involved in a debate with Jim Brown, who's an Academy member and the top biogeographer in the country, in the world, and an expert on energy relations and so on. And some time ago, Ann and I said we thought we had a 10% chance of escaping a total collapse of civilization. And Jim said, you guys are out of your minds. You're just nuts. He says, it's at most 1%. And we both agree that it's worth working for us to make it 11 and him to make it 1.1. On the other hand, I'm converging on him because that was about 4 years ago. I haven't seen a single thing that gives me the slightest hope that we're actually going to take any course that's going to prevent a collapse of civilization. And that's where the rubber meets the road. I don't think any scientist should not be putting at least 10% of their time into doing things they think is going to change that situation. We all have fun with our science. We all also can help individuals and our children and our grandchildren today by various things we do. But if you really care about the future and the future of humanity, then you're not looking in the right place. You're not doing the right work. I also believe, by the way, that it's utterly immoral for a person in a rich country to have more than 2 children unless there is a multiple birth in the second pregnancy, and one is much better, and because we are the super consumers in the world. You hear these incredible debates about immigration into the United States. It's a foreign policy problem. We've been grabbing the materials of the world for a long time, very richly, taking them in. What would you expect people to do but follow up the same stream? There's no way we're going to solve the immigration problem as long as we're an incredibly rich, comparatively island, compared to the rest of the world. Look what's happening in Europe today, all tied to the same thing, and including climate change, which of course is producing already large numbers of refugees, and the projections are unbelievable. To get back to the issue that I was talking about very briefly at the beginning, and I want to tell you about, because I think it's something that really this audience ought to A, know about, and B, criticize me on, because it's not an area of my particular expertise. I met a scientist, an orthodontist actually, who was very much involved in conservation issues in she's a Mexican, but she's an American citizen, and she and her husband are working in conservation, mostly in Mexico. And I met her through a colleague that I've been working with for years from UNAM. And she began to talk about how she had changed her entire life because she had discovered, partly through her own children, that the orthodontists are all doing it wrong. And that's why I'm going to tell you just a little bit about it, because I'm still working on it, and with her. It turns out that something was detected by George Catlin. Everybody remember George Catlin, the guy who did the great pictures of Indians? He traveled in the West before the Civil War, and was an artist and so on. And he noticed that the Indians had beautiful mouths full of uncrowded teeth, no particular problems there. And then in addition to calling the Europeans white, pale faces, they called them black mouths, because their mouths were always open. And Catlin, around 1850, actually wrote a book called Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life, I think was the exact title of it. And it turns out that we're seeing an epidemic now of mouth breathing in children, of things like sleep apnea, asthma, and so on. And when Sandy and a guy named John Mew has really done most of the work in England, look back at it, it's a thing that has occurred almost entirely since the agricultural revolution, and more recently since 1400 or 1500. If you go back and look at fossil skulls, and again, I wish the series were better and so on, you find that generally the teeth aren't crowded. There's a very nice arch, no need to pull out wisdom teeth, no need for orthodonture, and so on. And what happened is, I'm boiling a lot of stuff down here, is that as people settled down to practice agriculture, the first thing that they got was enough carbohydrate to change the flora in the mouth so that caries show up very rapidly. Dental caries come along with settlement. But then they also began to get very soft foods to wean the kids to, and that is a part of the problem. It turns out that the developmental system, as again, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm reading the literature, the developmental system of the airways, the face, the teeth, the jaws, and so on, have a critical period, just like everybody knows about the critical period in sight. If a kid is blindfolded or blinded till they're 10 years old, and then surgically you remove the cataracts or whatever was blinding them, they never learn to see. They can tell the background from the object or so on, but they can't tell a square against a triangle. Well, it turns out that I hope you all know there's a gene shortage sort of problem, that we don't have 10 million structural genes that determine where every tooth is, that the developmental system for the lower part of the face and so on is dependent on nursing for probably 2 to 3 years, with weaning being a gradual thing, but particularly weaning to foods that are chewable. That the jaw muscles are very strong, and the bones are very strong for applying a lot of pressure. But slow pressure, continual use, is what puts you into the right setup. And if you don't have that, you tend to go to mouth breathing. And mouth breathing, of course, You don't get the nitric oxide that's presumably partly bacteriostatic. You don't get the filtering of the air. You don't get the moistening of the air. And that leads to all kinds of problems, including, they think, sleep apnea, but a whole series of other things in the lungs. This is something, if true, and again, I'm pretty well convinced, and I've read a lot of the literature, if this is true, it's really an easy thing to fix. In fact, you can even do it. It's such that if the kid is weaned too early, but you get them 4 or 5 or 6, you can fix most of the problems. I've seen now thousands virtually of illustrations of what happens to kids whose jaws retract, their mandible retracts, the maxilla actually goes back some too. Of course, you get an actually ugly profile, and it can be fixed. It's harder to fix depending on how late you get to it. One of the interesting things is if you look at pictures of rich people from, say, 1600, they're the first ones in the West that really begin to pick up the distortions from this because they're the ones that could afford, of course, the pablum. Some people claim you should never feed a kid with a spoon. Anyway, one of the lessons coming out of this that relates to other things we're involved in today and in the past is denial. You all know the story of childbed fever, Semmelweis, in the I can't give it in detail, but around 1820 to 30, somebody knows the numbers, tell me, a Hungarian physician working in a maternity, just want to make sure I hadn't gone over, working in a maternity ward noticed that in the death rate from childbed fever everybody was concerned about childbed fever because it was killing about 1/3 of the women who had babies in these things. But he noticed the difference between two. He checked it out and he found that part of the difference was that the surgeons who did the doctors who did autopsies and took care of the women, that there was a higher mortality rate in those facilities. And so he said the doctors ought to wash their hands because they're getting little bits of corpse. This is before the germ theory. Little bits of corpse, and that was what was causing the childbed fever. And he actually came up with something which turned out to be antiseptic. I can't remember what it was, but some strong stuff the doctors started washing their hands with. He had access to 2 different facilities. The one where the doctors didn't wash their hands, the childbed fever mortality hung around 30%. In the one where they did wash their hands, it hung around 2%. That's a significant difference. He was actually one of the first people in medicine to actually start counting things to get answers. But the thing that's sort of pertinent for today is the doctors refused to do anything about it because A, it was accusing them of being the source of the problem. And that was, I think, the main reason they didn't. Until Pasteur came along and the germ theory was accepted, women kept dying because doctors wouldn't wash their hands. And today, orthodontists are still moving teeth around, extracting wisdom teeth and so on, which you may have to do eventually in some form or another. But instead of pushing, like all of us should be, to make sure that people get real diets, and make sure not just that they get the right food, but that they eat it right. The American Indians nursed for about 2 to 3 years, and interestingly, the mother, when it takes the child off the nipple, closes the lips. And it was the mouth breathing that was the clue. So if you got young children and you see them mouth breathing, particularly go look at them at night. It's sending a message that you really don't want to see and you want to do something about. Okay, I haven't presented an entirely cheery picture, and there's a lot of detail I've left out. What can we do about it? Well, what our group is trying to do about it, we formed an organization called the Mob. For the name it's M-A-H-B, but we like being mobsters. But we're trying to organize civil society. There are people all over the world that are concerned about various aspects of this sort of thing. There's actually a website for, I think I call it infant-led weaning. Trying to deal with some of the problems connected with baby food and so on. But they don't work together and they don't see the big picture, and they mostly nowadays, sadly, are having to struggle with each other for funds, which is so. that's one direction we can go. And if everybody got together and said, no, President Obama, you're not going to give out any more oil leases. We don't need the oil. Invading Iraq to get the oil was like invading Iraq to get cyanide if we were hungry. We fought all these wars over oil, and oil is the last thing we should be fighting. Well, not coal ought to be the last thing. Anyway, so we can do that. Or else we'll get in a situation which I tend towards now, where the answer was given very well by Schiller many years ago in Jungfrau von Orleans. Gegen der Dummheit kämpfen Götter selbstvergebens. Against stupidity, even gods struggle in vain. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It seemed to me that underlying all the tales that you told us and all the stories that you told us is the inability of us to sustain any sort of paradigm change in how we are going to deal with every one of these problems. And under the umbrella, the entire umbrella of climate change, everything you spoke to fits.
Well, let me say this. I think we basically, if you think about this, all our problems that we were talking about today, every last one of them comes from the agricultural revolution. If we hadn't had some families able to produce enough food that other people could do other things, we wouldn't have had the specialization that led to people doing the things that they're doing today. I think we need another agricultural revolution. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's unlikely. Why? I've lived through, there are some very few advantages to getting older, but when I was a kid, you could still lynch a black person in the southern part of the United States and send a picture of the lynching around on a postcard. My first girlfriend, when I was 8 or so, what were her job opportunities? She could be a nurse, she could be a school teacher in a lower grade, she could be a secretary. And we've come a long way there, but nowhere's near far enough. After all, if you want to solve the population problem, the first thing you do is give full equal rights and opportunities to women.
Yes.
No country in the world does that. It's a win-win, but nobody does it, including, I have friends in Sweden, and I've had long stories from Swedish friends about what happens to women in Sweden, glass ceiling. So, but we have changed. Society can change. Slavery is still around, but it's not around the way it used to be. Women, I was a pilot, I took instrument training from a woman, and probably most of you have flown on an airliner where a woman was the captain. When I can still remember when Joe Louis was the heavyweight champion of the world, newspapers talking about the need for a white hope. And I was a Dodger fan when Jackie Robinson broke in. And now, guess what? It turns out people with dark skins can play all kinds of sports. We never guessed, right? So you can have change, and it can happen rapidly. Who here knew in 1988 that 1989 would be the end of the Soviet Union and it would all collapse? Change. The Second World War made all kinds of changes, including changes in racial and gender relations. So if we could somehow generate that kind of thing, I think you could change society. It's just I'm not terribly hopeful, particularly looking at the candidates for the next election.
We have a question over there.
Thank you. I wonder what you felt the role of massive scale terraforming in terms of agriculture and reforestation. What role does that play in perhaps softening the blow or actually creating progress?
Well, again, we have a very serious problem of, first of all, we are doomed, even if a couple billion people die, to have as many people in the year 2000 as we have, 2100 as we have today. So how you handle the agricultural situation, can you actually, for example, change the system to preserve the biodiversity? I should have said more about the extinction crisis, the extinction of populations and species. They're the working parts of our life support systems. And there are two general arguments. We should concentrate human activities in smaller areas, up the productivity of farming, and let more go back to wilderness, or you can move it, design a system in which the two can get along together. The work we're doing in Costa Rica is trying to figure out what the best ways of doing the latter are. But the point is, nothing's happening. For instance, there was a long, long argument in the literature of conservation biology, mostly about 20 years ago, it was called the single large or several small arguments. If you had 10 square miles of forest, would you prefer to have it as one 10 square mile piece or four two and a half square mile pieces? And it went on and on and on, and there were arguments on both sides. To this day, I don't know of a single biological reserve that was designed. I know of one where some of the designation of the design helped, but basically nobody ever faced that problem. Nobody's considered to this day. And so there's just a lot of stuff out there that's not acted on. Most people are unaware of these issues. I have yet to hear a single important problem mentioned in all the blather that's come out so far on the election a year and a half from now. If, by the way, I should say, all of my colleagues that I've discussed it with, and that's a lot, agree on one thing. If you wanted to have one step that would move the world through the US in the right direction, it would be to get the money out of politics.
I think that we have time for one question. Can you give this gentleman the mic?
Thank you, Paul. Larry. My question is I think it's a softball question. We had a co-occurring event with the Conference of World Affairs this year about bees, and it was in the news last night about 40% of the colonies are collapsing, and it seems to be kind of a serious issue, and it's tied into the agricultural business, and I won't go into all the details about it, but it seems like we're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back because the bees pollinate so much of our food and whatnot. And I was just wondering if maybe you could comment on that. And for another edgeway is that I think it's generally accepted now that hepatitis C was kind of a human creation, and or the main epidemic was kind of spread through the vaccine, the immune globulin, the gamma globulin. So, in other words,
I'm having trouble here.
in other words, we're kind of going forward with our science, but then we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. So that's the question. Thank you.
I know you couldn't hear it. I think that, tell me if I'm wrong, the question is the die-off of the bees in the hives and dealing with yet another example of maltreatment of our natural environment.
That's a particularly interesting case. First of all, we have, with our many activities, killed off large populations of many of the native pollinators that could take over from the honeybee. The honeybee is a Eurasian import to this country. Right now, I think for people who only understand, not you, but people who only understand financial arguments, it's about $18 billion, the last I heard, of agricultural production in the US that's dependent on the honeybee, and they're disappearing. The colony collapse disorder was apparently very bad this last year. Nobody knows exactly what's happening as far as I've been able to determine. There's mites that get into honeybee colonies. There are other problems, but the most suspicious is the nicotinoid pesticides that have become extremely common. Our use of pesticides is done as stupidly as our use of antibiotics. In other words, that's the problem with not teaching people evolution, because you know absolutely if you keep using the same antibiotic, you know what's going to happen. Actually, it's interesting because there's been big technical arguments over the years about whether evolution was predictable. And the one place where it really is predictable and has been predicted is in pesticide and antibiotic resistance. I mean, we're getting antibiotic-resistant soil floras around the world. We talk about monumentally stupid. We still feed antibiotics to animals. I mean, anyway. So, but the Europeans, I think, are moving to ban the nicotinoids. We haven't. And of course, that's because of the wonderful chemistry industry. They have great lobbyists. You know, unfortunately, we don't really teach anything about how the government works to people in the United States. They have no idea. And I won't go into that because hopefully you all have ideas, and that's the hook.
Thank you very much, Paul.